Hi, this is Sean Perrin, and you're listening to episode 45 of the Clarinet Podcast, the show where I discuss all that's new and neat with clarinet with the neatest people in the industry. In today's episode, I speak with Wes Rice, who is the founder of Rice Clarinet Works. We discuss maintenance tips that every clarinetist can use, his custom clarinet selection process, of course many other aspects of his workshop, and of course his line of barrels and bells, including the amazing industrial barrel that is actually a collaboration with the metal artist named Chris Bathgate. For more information about Wes, his products, and his company, please see these show notes for episode 45 at clarinet.com. The giveaway for today's episode, actually we're going to have two lucky winners. One will receive a Rice Clarinet Works Delrin barrel, and the other will receive a standard wooden barrel. These barrels are valued at $150 US each, and thank you so much to Wes for such an incredible giveaway. If you'd like the chance to win these and other items mentioned on the podcast, be sure to go to clarinet.com and enter your email address in our email subscription box. This will also give you access to free content updates, special offers, coupons, and more. And now I bring you Wes Rice of Rice Clarinet Works after a brief message from our sponsor. Today's episode was brought to you by D'Addario Woodwinds. Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is refining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with the world's most innovative techniques, so you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds. So I'm here today with Wes Rice, who is the founder of Rice Clarinet Works. Wes, welcome to the Clarinet Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So your business, Rice Clarinet Works, you offer clarinet selection services, repair, you do accessory manufacture for your own brand and other brands. It sounds like there's so much going on. Would you walk me through sort of what that's like for you? It must be incredibly busy at the office.
Yeah, it is. It is very busy. So kind of a normal day, we start at 8. There's actually 4 of us daily in the shop, just doing kind of all aspects of clarinet things. So we start at 8. Every day we have kind of an overhaul or repair set up. So one of my employees, Bert, he's always doing what I call the day one of the overhauls, which means a disassembly, cleaning, adjusting keys, key fitting, basically the works there. We also have manufacturing, which my employee Mike is doing. So he's overrunning the machines, the lathe, the milling machine, things like that. I'm on a daily basis doing overhauls, so I'll be doing the reassembly. So I'll get a clean clarinet from Bert, and I will basically put it all back together, adjust ring heights, the pads, the seal, the feel of it, everything like that. So my employees stop at 4:45, but my day continues on quite a bit after that because there is so much to do, and we're constantly developing new products. We've got barrels, and bells are something that I'm trying to really get out there right now. But it doesn't leave a whole lot of time for development. But that's something that I kind of do after everyone leaves. So it's, every day is kind of something different, and every day is pretty diverse and long, I would say.
Diverse and long, I like that.
Yeah.
I do definitely want to get into your products and a little more about the repair business. But first, what was it that got you started with repair?
Well, I grew up kind of always having an entrepreneurial spirit, I would say. And so I was always doing little things to, I suppose, avoid getting some sort of job working for someone else. So I would mow lawns, even like sell golf balls at the golf course. So I always was doing little things to, make an income. And when I got to college, I had already kind of been experimenting around just taking my instrument apart and cleaning it and replacing pads and things like that. So naturally, I kind of offered that to some of my colleagues at the school at the Peabody Conservatory. And so they ended up, bringing their instruments to me, just little things, pads here and there, key bumpers, tenon corks, things like that. So that's really how it got started. I just started doing it on the side while I was in school. And fast forward to when I graduated, after I got my master's degree, I was working with Con Selmer out in Indiana, but they kind of were in a process of downsizing, and so I got laid off. Well, that kind of left me with no work to do except the clarinet repair side of it, which I had kind of been building all along. But I kind of used that as a starting point to really dive into it full time and just really, tackle clarinets all day, every day. So I really started advertising, on Google really and getting just overhauls. And after I moved back from Indiana, I ended up getting some equipment and I started making barrels and things like that. So, that was really the start of it. And from there, it just kind of grew and grew organically. More and more people started seeking me out, and we started going to more of these trade shows, more of the events, such as Midwest that I think you're going to in a few weeks, hopefully.
Well, we'll see. The Kickstarter campaign at the time of this recording is at 96%. So
awesome. Well, I think we'll probably see you there then, I suppose. But yeah, I mean that's really how it started. It just started with me doing little repairs for my colleagues, and then it just kind of grew from there.
Wow, so you're completely self-taught then?
Yes, in terms of instrument repair, I am. I learned a few little tips and tricks at Con Selmer, but yeah, I kind of naturally pick up on mechanical things. So, just taking the clarinet apart myself and looking at how things function and how they work, and then also being a player, knowing how they should function in the end. That kind of allowed me to teach myself to do it.
I think that's such an interesting point you raise, actually, kind of like knowing where it needs to be and then finding a way to get it to that point instead of sort of starting at the mechanical end. What is different about you than other players, do you feel, as far as your desire to kind of just dig in there and try it? I mean, I know people who are literally scared to replace a pad.
Right. Well, I've never been scared of taking things apart, and my parents can attest to that. I took apart all kinds of things when I was younger, TVs, VCRs, all kinds of stuff. So when I got a clarinet, my first real clarinet, a buffet, when I was in 9th grade, my parents were horrified one day to come home and find me with it in pieces on the floor. But I kind of naturally was never really scared to take things apart. I knew that I wouldn't screw it up enough that I couldn't put it back together. So, I do some various master classes here and there, and, I do teach people to take apart their instruments and do cleanings and things like that. And, some people are faster than others, but I've never really encountered anyone who damaged their clarinet taking it apart. So, I mean, I would encourage people to maybe seek out some YouTube videos. I'm sure there's something on that topic. And if there's not, I'd be happy to make something if someone wants to get in touch with me. But, I would encourage anyone to take their clarinet apart and, maybe just take it apart, put it back together, or just take one key off, put it back together. And that's really a good starting point, I would say.
Well, and if you're really nervous about this, like I kind of was, I don't really know why, but what I ended up doing was buying a cheap clarinet on Kijiji. I guess you may not know what that is. That's like a Canadian version of Craigslist.
Yeah.
And so I just bought a cheap clarinet on there and took it apart and got some cheap pads and stuff and started learning a little bit too. I wouldn't say I'm anywhere near any sort of actual level, but it sure saved me the grief of, oh my God, I just got this overhauled. I don't really want to disassemble my $4,000 instrument or whatever.
Yeah, I'm sure anyone who has a $3,000 or $4,000 instrument also has like a $100 Bundy sitting in their closet. So the only downside I would say to taking apart one of those is if you're replacing a pad, there's a lot of times it's actually harder to work on one of those student instruments than it is a professional quality instrument because they're not manufactured with the same care. So I would say, start with your old Bundy in the closet or whatever you've got. And once you get more comfortable, then switch to something a little nicer, something that you didn't initially want to tackle.
So what is something that maybe every clarinet player should have in their bag then, as far as a small toolkit or something to help them with minor repairs when they can't come to someone like you for a full overhaul?
Sure. Well, if they're comfortable with replacing a pad, I think probably the best thing would be obviously a screwdriver because, you'll want to at least take the key off, get all the old glue out there. If let's say a pad falls off, or even if you just want to take out the old pad, it's a good idea to, take the key off, get all the old glue out, and clean it out. Sometimes the hinge rods or the pivots don't want to come out right away, and so a small pair of pliers is a really good idea. I like either needle nose. Now, this is not what I use, but this is what I'd recommend for people because they're cheap. Either a needle nose pair of pliers or what's called a chain nose pair of pliers. And they, I found, are the best for keeping in your clarinet case. They're small, they're easy to use, they're not too expensive like some of the pliers that I use, which are parallel pliers in case anyone does want to get something that's a little nicer. In addition to that, I'd say a lighter is a good idea. You want to make sure the flame doesn't go too high, so maybe like a 1/4-inch flame. And if you do need to replace a pad, obviously you'll want to have some glue as well. So I just use either hot glue sticks or I have some specialized pellets, but obviously most people wouldn't have access to that. So even just a glue stick with a razor blade, so you can cut it into small little wafers, I would say. Mm-hmm. And then, maybe a few pads, different sizes. Some websites allow you to get like a pad set. Music Medic is a great place for that. They do sell pad sets. So even just having them around and, even if you're not comfortable, maybe your stand partner knows a little bit more about it. So even just having some of those on hand is a really good idea. Something that I find very often is that most people don't oil their clarinet or oil the keys of their clarinet very often. And so a nice little dropper bottle of key oil is a really good idea. Some Q-tips or cotton swabs, they're also a really good idea. Sometimes, you can get some, dead skin and some things that build up in the tone holes. And so if you notice that, before a performance or sometime important, that can obviously affect the tuning of the instrument and the feel of it. So it's a good idea to just maybe dip one of those in water and clean out some of the open tone holes.
So is there a particular type of key oil you would suggest? I mean, it's funny because Peter Spriggs actually, I asked him what his pet peeves were, which I'm going to ask you as well. And his kind of was like, well, in a way he said it doesn't really matter because he always does overhauls. So he takes them from nothing and takes them to like new condition every time. And so the maintenance doesn't concern him that much, but he said that the one thing that, he really thinks people should do is oil their keys. So what type would you suggest?
Yeah, well, I definitely agree with him. And that's probably my biggest complaint, although if people don't either oil their keys, it does give me more business in the long run. So it's a funny situation, but that's the one thing that I definitely see that most people don't do. And what I recommend is the oil from Doctor's Products. I think it's called Syntec. Mm-hmm. I haven't done like a real study or anything like that of the different oils, but I kind of just go off of what he says on his website, and that's that the oil actually bonds to the metal, and that I think it was developed for the International Space Station or something interesting like that.
So it's good enough for your clarinet, basically.
Exactly, yeah. So that's what I use. If someone doesn't want to spend the money on that, it is a little pricey, but it lasts forever. But if you don't want to spend the money on that, I actually just, before I bought this stuff, I used just some motor oil. So like some 30 weight, no detergent. That's what I used exclusively before this. But pretty much any oil is better than no oil. And I'd say if you're using something really nice that bonds to the metal, like the Doctor's Product stuff, once every 4 to 6 months, something like that is adequate. Whereas if you're using just motor oil or clock oil or something like that, that's probably more like an every month or 2 month type thing. And it's really easy to do. You don't even have to take apart the clarinet. You just basically put a small drop where the key actually meets the post. And if it's dry inside the hinge rod, it will wick in, and that's all you have to do. Just depress your keys a few times and it'll wick in there and cover everything and protect your keys. And we're basically just protecting against wear. A lot of the work that we do in the overhaul is very extensive key fitting. So that means just making sure that the hinge rod or the pivot exactly matches the key. And so if you go without putting oil on it, it will wear out the key. Kind of like if you have a car and you don't put oil in it, that's going to be pretty bad very quickly. So, the same thing happens with clarinet. If you have a dry two metal parts rubbing on each other, one is going to give and wear out. And so that's what we're just trying to prevent.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the just the general motor oil. I actually use a mechanical gear oil, and I think I bought a thing about the size of a bottle of wine for like $5 about 5 years ago, and it's still 99% full. So you don't even need to use very much.
No, I mean, literally, it's just a drop at each point where the key meets the post. It's one drop. So, I mean, if you have even an ounce of key oil or motor oil, it's going to last you almost a lifetime, I would say.
Yeah, it's going to last forever. How do you feel about this sort of thing needing to be a part of clarinetist's formal musical training and education, even from the beginning?
Well, I feel that it's extremely important. And I find that it's not taught very often. At some of these master classes that I do, I find that, no one has heard this stuff. No one has heard about oiling your keys. And I feel like, especially if people are getting private instructions, that's something that their teacher should tell them about.
Yeah, oftentimes their teacher didn't know, and the teacher before them didn't know, and it was always just, take it to the repair shop type thing. But what's a book you'd recommend for people to look into to start their own sort of, I don't want to replace your business, obviously, but there must be a way for people to do some of their own maintenance at home.
Honestly, I don't know of any. I have one, I would say I found one book in the library at West Virginia where I got my master's degree. And I just copied a few pages here and there. Honestly, I don't even remember what it's called. I'm sure there are good books out there. I just can't recommend any because I don't have them.
Yeah. Well, there's not many, I don't think. I don't think there are many books, but
maybe I should write one.
Yeah. Well, there's a new one. It's called the Clarinet Manual, and it's actually by that same company that does all the car manuals. I think it's called Hayes or Haynes, maybe. I'm just trying to remember the brand name.
Oh, yeah, Haynes, yeah.
Is it Haynes? Yeah. They just put out a clarinet and saxophone manual 2 years ago.
Oh, that's interesting.
Complete with pictures. Yeah, I'll have to send you a link to it. I haven't completely read my copy, so I can't really attest to what's in there. But it is just something kind of interesting to skim through for sure. But yeah, I think it's something you're totally right. I mean, this is something people should be more aware of and know how to take care of their instrument the same as they might maintain their bicycle. I mean, it's not something they should be really afraid of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's as simple as just putting a drop of oil there, and honestly, that's most of the maintenance that you need to do. As far as cleaning, if someone is not comfortable taking the keys off, you can at least clean the open holes with, as I said before, the cotton swab and some water. I mean, it's as easy as that. And if you find that you're getting a lot of buildup and you're not comfortable taking your instrument apart, if you have buildup in the open tone holes, you can almost assume that you'll have some dirtiness and things like that inside the covered tone holes. So maybe that's something that, if you're not comfortable with, you can take it to a shop. But certainly there are a lot of things that the average player can do to maintain their instrument. And honestly, it's a money-saving thing. If you're oiling your clarinet, if you're taking care of it, you're going to spend less money in the shop, and you don't have to see people like me quite as often.
So how often should someone come to see someone like you, though, if they're taking care of their instrument, or, I mean, if they're not? What's the general sort of recommendation for getting your clarinet seriously maintained with an overhaul?
Well, with an overhaul, I always recommend, if the clarinet has never been overhauled, there are so many things that we do that the factory it wouldn't be economical for them to go to the level that we do. So, anyone who's serious at all, and that includes people of any age, so from a middle school student who has like a decent clarinet, a buffet, either intermediate or professional, to, anyone else who's serious about playing the instrument, they should definitely consider an overhaul, because it will just get things right from the very beginning. So in the overhaul, we'll adjust things that the factory doesn't adjust, like the ring heights. We'll do a lot of spring tension work. We'll do key fitting that is a lot more precise than they're able to do or want to do. And so after that, it's actually pretty easy to maintain the clarinet, because everything's brand new on it. the pads that we use are actually, we use cork and synthetic pads, so they actually hold up a lot better than just your standard felt double skin pads. So after that, I do recommend either sending it in or having or doing a cleaning yourself every 6 months. And of course, that depends on how much you're actually playing the clarinet. But that maintenance is really important, as we just talked about before. But if you're properly maintaining the clarinet, I'd say maybe get an overhaul once every, let's say an average of 5 years, something like that. If you're playing it very often, let's say you don't keep up with the maintenance, maybe bump it up to around 3. But, it really depends, and it's really an individual thing based on the instrument, the level of care that was taken, the player, how rough they are with the clarinet, things like that, which would determine how soon after that initial overhaul that they would need another one. But as long as they keep up with the maintenance, then everything is pretty minimal after that point.
So as soon as you buy it, it seems a little bit backwards, but you should get it overhauled right away.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate, and I get a lot of odd looks from people when I say that, people who are not in the professional clarinet realm, but some parents that want to get their kids a really nice instrument, they look at me like I'm crazy. But we just spend a lot of time doing things that just sometimes are not right from the factory, and even just looking at it when the clarinet is brand new and going over some things, like a lot of times the instrument doesn't even fit together, believe it or not. There's differences in humidity and temperature between, let's say France for buffet and here. So even just having it looked at initially is very important. And that's one of the things that we definitely do with every clarinet is we do kind of what I call just a professional setup, which is just kind of making sure things are right from the beginning. So if someone doesn't want to get an overhaul right away, if they just spent $3,000, $4,000, they don't want to spend the money to get an overhaul on top of that, whether you buy from me or some other shop, it's very important that shop actually does a setup on the instrument and makes sure everything is at least mostly right. You can't get things perfect, but, make sure they spend, an hour or 2 or 3 hours just making sure things fit right. The spring tension is at least adequate. The rings are not, uneven and high or low, things like that.
So this all ties in, actually, as far as the other aspect of your business, which is helping people select instruments. And you actually, as you mentioned, you worked as a professional clarinet tester for Conn-Selmer. What does that entail? What was that like?
It was interesting. We worked on the Bliss clarinet. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Absolutely.
I think they are still making it, but that was it was interesting because every clarinet came in with different kind of, I don't want to say problems, but when you have a manufactured products, I'm there to kind of find those problems. So every single clarinet, I had a procedure laid out where I would, let's say, rock every key back and forth to make sure they weren't wobbling. I would check the seal. I would check the spring tension. I would eventually play it to make sure it played well. And I would say that helped me quite a bit in being able to select buffet clarinets. So I'll go down to the warehouse in Jacksonville, or I'll meet up with my supplier somewhat locally and just try a bunch of instruments. Now, I don't go through and check every key with the buffet clarinets because I know that I'm going to take every clarinet apart when I get it back to the shop anyway. So what I look for, or what I listen for, is just a really great sound, a really nice resonant sound, something that you take one clarinet. This clarinet that I would pick just requires less effort for the amount of sound that you get out of it. And of course, I test things like tuning. Those were also things that I tested at Conn-Selmer. And of course, you want to look at the clarinet a little bit and make sure there's no glaring deficiencies like some chips or things like that. I've never found anything like that. But of course, there's a little bit of looking at the clarinet. But when I hand select one, it's 99% just playing. How does it play? Does it play in tune? Things like that.
So the hand selection process, it interests me because you mentioned a few things we should be looking for, like the tuning and the ease of playing and all these things. But aren't they a rather personal process, or do you sort of look at your job kind of like sort of weeding through the ones that maybe someone shouldn't consider and then still giving them the chance to pick for themselves?
Sure. So anyone who wants to purchase a clarinet from me, I say, come down to the shop if you want to. And at the shop, we don't have a ton of instruments, but we have 6 or 7 of what I would call the best of the best instruments. So this is after I've gone through, let's say, 60 to 70 clarinets. Usually I'll pick 1 out of 10. So these clarinets that I'll have at the shop are, pretty spectacular, at least in my eyes. I don't think I've ever had a customer come in and say, "Oh, I don't like any of your clarinets." So I've always had that in the back of my mind that, maybe these clarinets I'm picking for people, someone might not like, someone might pick another one. But I haven't found that to be true, at least for my customers, surprisingly. I've found that, if I pick one and I say, this is really a spectacular instrument, and I have, let's say, a professional come in and I say, hey, try this one, they almost always love it, and they almost always agree with me 100%. So I don't know what that means, but at least, let's say for the majority of people, and at least everyone that I've come into contact with, they tend to agree with my process and agree with the instruments that I've picked out.
Well, things like intonation and making sure there's an ease of sound. I mean, those are things that everyone does want. So if you've done some of the legwork and then they can sort of make the final decision of which instrument's right for them, I think that's great. Is there an extra cost to this service on top of there must be?
No charge, actually.
Oh. So you're saving us 60 to 70 clarinets of trying, and then there's no extra charge for that?
No extra charge. And in fact, Buffet does set a minimum price, and I charge the minimum price that they allow. If shameless plug, but if anyone is looking for an instrument right now, Buffet is offering a $200 off special on R13 specifically. But I do sell them at the lowest price that they allow, and what I call the professional setup, I also include that for free. So, I really want people to get the best clarinet possible. I don't want them to get the clarinet home and be like, oh gosh, this just isn't playing right, which, sometimes some of these stores, they'll just buy the clarinets, basically open the case and look at it and sell it to the customer. And it does need some work initially. So, I want to make the experience as painless as possible. So I weed out all the quote unquote bad clarinets, I suppose, even though they're not. I'm just picking the best ones.
Yeah.
And of course I provide a clarinet that is, at least somewhat set up, professionally set up. So, and then of course, if it's, let's say, a professional and they want to get an overhaul right away, I'll even, instead of doing my setup, I'll just say, hey, I'll give you $100 off the overhaul cost because I don't have to do the setup.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting, actually. And for any students listening, this is one reason you might want to consider purchasing an instrument from someone like Wes or whoever's in your area, or if you're in a different country. But look for someone who actually does the work and the professional setups and things, because if you just go to the store and buy the one that came from the factory and sort of got jostled around on the plane and by bus or whatever and then sat on a shelf for 6 months and then finally got sold, it's not really gonna play at the same level, and it's gonna need this work anyways. So it's just a chance to get something that's really, really top notch. So before we move on completely from your repair business, I did want to ask you if you had any other pet peeves about what people do as far as not maintaining their instruments properly.
Well, as a repairman, it is a little off-putting when we get a clarinet and it smells bad and it's very dirty. And, some of these clarinets are just because they've been sitting around in a closet for years, and maybe some little mites have eaten some of the pads and things like that.
Yeah.
But, when you have a clarinet that's being played daily and it's someone's main clarinet, it does bug me a little bit when you get a clarinet that comes in that should be, somewhat clean. Of course, they're sending it in for a cleaning a lot of times. But sometimes you'll get the really, really dirty ones. And, of course, it's their clarinet. They can do what they want with it. But, if someone is sending in a dirty clarinet like that, they're not properly maintaining it. So, and again, of course, it's their decision. If they don't want to maintain it, that's fine by me. I'll end up fixing it sooner. But that is one of the things that, I know that they could be doing better, and they could be saving themselves money and hassle in the long run.
What is the strangest repair job you've ever encountered?
Oh, interesting. A couple of years ago, I had a set of Selmers. I think they were from the 1920s or 30s, and they were unplated keys. And the weird thing about them was that they had it was a plateau system clarinet. For those of you who don't know what that is instead of the open tone holes, what are called the chimneys, where you put your fingers normally, this actually had pads, kind of like a bass clarinet. So they were completely covered. I haven't seen anything like that since, thankfully, because they, I think, took about 70 to 80 hours each to overhaul. Yeah, it was a ridiculous job to do, one that I probably shouldn't have taken on, probably wasn't worth it in the long run, but it was certainly interesting to see them. And I think they may have been kind of a one-of-a-kind thing, maybe some sort of experiment at Selmer. But certainly the most interesting clarinets that I've ever seen come through the shop.
I've always thought that should be a thing, though, but maybe that's why it's not, is because it's their real, not a treat to maintain. But for young students, I think it would be nice to have the pad covers, kind of like they have on flutes for a little while, but maybe it doesn't work as well on clarinets.
Yeah, well, I agree in some aspects, and in some I don't. On one hand, it's great to have the student learn from the very start that they have to put their hands in a certain position or else nothing comes out.
But what if their fingers are too small?
Yeah, there you go. So that was what I was going to say.
Oh, okay, sorry.
If you have a student with small fingers, and that can obviously be very difficult for them. I believe there is something on the market. It's like a student instrument. I don't know the brand, but I think there is something like that. I do get contacted because I do kind of what I would call custom work, fabricating keys and, just odd stuff like that for certain people. I do get contacted every now and then about making, let's say, a right hand be a plateau system. And that's because some of my customers are a little bit older and some of them get arthritis. So that's another good use for it. But in order to convert their existing clarinet to that, it's very, very expensive. So I haven't actually had anyone follow through, but you're talking, between $500 and $1,000. So as you say, it would be really nice if something, at least in something other than a beginner clarinet, it would be nice if something was on the market like that.
Well, there's a practical use for those kind of modifications, and that's the next thing I wanted to talk about, actually, was this aspect of your business. I once had a student who had some sort of nerve problem in one of his fingers from an injury, and he couldn't feel if he was closing the hole or not. So unfortunately, that was not an option for him to customize his instrument. So he ended up having to switch to saxophone, which he wasn't as fond of, but it worked better for him. But you guys offer all sorts of customizations there, including extensions of the range of a normal B flat and A clarinet down to low E flat, basset extensions, extensions for bass clarinets. How much demand is there for this stuff? And it seems kind of esoteric. Like, why would someone want their A clarinet to go down to an E flat?
Well, of course, on the A clarinet, the Mozart concerto was written with that extended range, and the version that most of us play is really just transposed up on some of the lower notes. So there is that. I am not asked to do these type of things very often. In fact, I've only made about 2 bass clarinet extensions ever. But I started out a couple of years ago with one of my longtime customers asking me to do it, and I said, sure, I'll give it a try. So it took quite a long time. I had to kind of modify a lot of my equipment in order to do it, but I kind of treated it as a learning experience. And that allowed me to custom make keys, experiment around with the wood and tone hole placement and things like that. So, although I don't get a lot of demand for it, it is something kind of interesting. And in regards to like the A clarinet basset extension, I've kind of actually stopped doing that recently because I don't have the time to really make it as good as I think it should be. And so I've kind of pulled back on that. But in terms of the bass clarinet extensions, what I'm looking to do in the future is maybe have some sort of, I would say, standardized product, or at least mostly standardized, and then we adapt a few various things to make it work on their clarinet. But that's something I'm looking to kind of do more of more of an assembly line process in order to get the costs down a little bit. Because right now it is very expensive to do something like that. But some of my customers have a lot of sentimental value in their older bass clarinets, and they want the extended range. And so I say, sure. I mean, I'm willing to do it if they understand that, it's going to cost X amount, and it may or may not be worth it if they go to resell it. But a lot of these people want their clarinets to be great, and they have sentimental value to them. And so it doesn't matter about the cost to them. They just want that extended range.
So we might be kind of geeking out here for a second, but so let's just think about this. So the B flat clarinet, then I could see potentially the low E flat. I mean, that would allow you to play all the notes from an A clarinet without actually needing an A clarinet. But what's the cost like? I mean, it must be getting a custom designed bottom piece that's removable must be rather prohibitive, no?
Well, if we're just talking about adding one note to the instrument, so if we went to a low E flat for your let's say your B flat clarinet, it probably, I'm looking at my website right now because I get it asked this so seldom. It is $5.99 to do it, because it's basically you're adding a little piece of wood to your clarinet between the bell and the lower joint, and then you're having me make one key, and a post, and of course do some drilling and things like that. So that is somewhat invasive and somewhat extensive, but it's not a crazy cost or anything like that. Now the bass clarinet extension, that is over $3,000. It's $3,150 is what I charge for it. So that is a lot more, but of course bass clarinets are more expensive, and they have a lot more key work. They're more expensive to maintain just overall, I would say.
And are most of the extensions you make, they're all removable?
I prefer to have them permanent. Now, they are removable if you take some screws out and things like that. But the thing you encounter when you make it removable is you have to make twice the amount of keys, because you have to have little bridge keys going between the removable part and the non-removable and the lower joint of your instrument. So by having it more permanent and just screwed together, I can eliminate half the keys. So I can just have one key that spans the joint of the extension and the lower joint.
So you also manufacture, of course, we mentioned the bells and the barrel products. And I'm interested, you said that at some point you just sort of got a CNC machine, but how did this transition from starting to work on clarinets to actually making these sort of parts for them? Was it sort of a natural progression? I mean, someone comes in with a broken barrel and needs a new one, or how does that get started?
Yeah, that's exactly how I started. It was a natural progression. Coming out of the Overhaul side of it, where I wanted to really get people's clarinet to play the very best that it could, I figured the next best thing was to do a barrel, which obviously can make a huge difference in how the clarinet sounds. And that was actually, it's still somewhat difficult to do in terms of producing the right dimensions and design and things like that. But of all the parts, that's the easiest one to do. So that's the one I started with. I, for years, had a manual machine, which, I just did everything kind of by hand, very precisely, but it's still hand operated. And that kind of grew into wanting to do things more accurately and more consistently. And so I did purchase a CNC lathe, which, for those of you who don't know what that is, it basically will spin a part. It's kind of like let's say a cordless drill, except bigger. So you would put the barrel in, let's say, the chuck of the cordless drill and spin it, and then you have various tools which come in and remove material in a circular pattern. So that's how it started, just trying to do things for my customers to get their instrument to play better. And when I purchased the CNC machine, I kind of saw a market where a lot of the barrel makers around the country don't really have access to this type of equipment. And also in my own shop, I was using it quite a bit, but it also sat idle quite a bit. So I thought, well, I could be using this machine to make products that people want to make, and they want to make more consistently through my process than they could perhaps do on their own equipment. So I started asking barrel makers around the country if I could make parts for them. And it started out with barrels, and then it kind of went from there. And we make now all kinds of things. So we make, in addition to barrels, tuning rings, CNC mouthpieces. We make those on our mill and our lathe. And, just all kinds of neat things for people. We even make wooden ligatures, and now we're getting started on a reed machine, actually. So
wow,
it's pretty interesting how things have gone.
And it's going so well that you actually don't just manufacture your own products, you handle manufacturing for other companies. How did that get started?
Right. So these are the people around the country that I was just referring to. So that I strictly called up people and asked. A lot of the people didn't have the capacity, and they wanted to come out with, let's say, their own barrel, but they didn't have the equipment. Some of these people are big names in the industry, but they didn't have a line of barrels. Let's say they just had mouthpieces. So for instance, Walter Grabner is someone who I just started working with recently. And, of course, he's very well known in the clarinet industry, and he has his mouthpieces, but he didn't have a line of barrels because he didn't have the equipment to produce it. So I offered that to him, and he said, sure. So basically we take what he wants to do in terms of what kind of sound he wants to do, and he does something kind of interesting, which is keeping the same barrel for B flat and A. So just having one that kind of, so we designed it in a way that it kind of bridges the gap and works for both, as opposed to some of the other people we work with. They have specifically an A barrel and specifically a B flat barrel, which is also what I do. So that's kind of how it grew. I mean, it was basically just me calling up people and asking, and people in the back of their mind, I suppose, always had something that they wanted to do. And I find that that's the most enjoyable part of my day, is not only designing and making things that perhaps have never been made before, but also, satisfying not only my customer, let's say the barrel maker, but also their customers as well. So it's something that is really interesting to me.
So one of the most interesting and unique collaborations I think you've got going, which I don't know if there's anything else in the industry like this, is your collaboration with Chris Bathgate, and it's kind of you call it an industrial themed barrel. And is this an aluminum shell? I'm holding one right now. I've had the chance to try it. It's like a metal outer layer, and then inside it comes in either wood or Delrin. This thing's got some weight to it. And what's really interesting for listeners is, like, well, first of all, it looks incredibly cool. It's kind of got inlaid black sections and sort of a polished exterior on the aluminum here. But this guy's art sells for thousands and thousands of dollars. So how did this get going?
Well, I had seen his art on the internet, and that's just something that I was like, wow, this is really cool. I've got to meet this guy. So I took the whole shop up to see his shop, and we met, I think, about 2 years ago or so. And, I saw all his equipment and what he could do, and I was really, really impressed. And his artwork is just amazing. And some of it sells for $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 because there's so much work involved. For your listeners, you should definitely check him out. He has some amazing stuff out there, and he has a lot of images on his website as well. So while we were at his shop, I kind of popped the question, would you like to work on something together? And it's interesting because he kind of has this philosophy of art that you don't make something that is actually functional, which might sound weird. But because the clarinet has a long history of, I guess, artistry, and, at least in like the flute world, there's all kinds of like decorative things, decorative artwork. And there's some flutes that, I don't know, I've seen one that has like a forest theme even. So there's some interesting artwork that can go into musical instruments. So he agreed to actually work on something together. So I said, well, right now I'm just producing barrels. And so can you maybe come up with something that would make this barrel look more industrial or whatever you want. I kind of gave him free rein and said, do whatever you want, and let's do 10 of them. And so he came up with basically what it is an aluminum sleeve. So that means that it's our barrel on the inside. So we just make our standard barrel, and then instead of having like an exterior taper, as you'll normally see, we turn it down to a certain dimension that's much smaller. So it's just a little bit bigger than the sockets. And so then we actually put the sleeve and glue it over top of the regular barrel. So it does give it a little more weight. It doesn't really affect the sound very much. In fact, some of them can sound better than just the standard barrels. It just depends on which clarinet you match it up with. But of course, the cool thing is they just look awesome, and they really catch people's eye. And I think the coolest thing for us has been, we haven't sold a ton of them because they're $249. They're a little more expensive than our standard barrels. But the coolest thing is it just draws all kinds of people over to us at events. That everyone wants to know, what is that? How's that made? Why? So yeah, it's just been a really cool experience working with him and having him design those for us.
Well, one of my favorite things is I've been trying this over the last few months here is to take it to schools when I do clinics. The kids, their eyes bug out and they're like, wow, look how cool that is. Wow, can I see that? And I actually tried this at Clarinet Fest with Eric Salazar, who was a guest on episode 8. And he loved it. I don't know if he's gotten in touch to consider one, but we both found, and maybe this was just a placebo effect based on what you just said, but when I compared this one, which is the Delrin version, to the other Delrin barrel I've been trying out here from you, it seemed much louder, much more present. I imagine it's perfect for people in marching band, perhaps except for the weight, but it's incredibly loud and full sounding. Is that, do you think that's caused by the extra density of the metal, or is that just a placebo effect?
I think that might be that you just found the right barrel for your instrument, because I've actually experimented with doing all aluminum barrels, and I've found that when they do have a lot of mass like that, they don't play that well, believe it or not. The way I got them to play well is to actually reduce the mass and make them really skinny. And so I haven't actually come out with one or anything like that because they kind of look a little ridiculous. But it was nice to just experiment around and see acoustic wise what happens when we make a barrel out of something different. So I would say that you just found the right barrel for your instrument, and some other player could put that barrel on their clarinet and they might experience the opposite results. I find that the barrel is really matched to the clarinet and not so much the player. One of the services that I offer a lot of times, when someone gets an overhaul, they have their clarinet in the shop, I'm all finished, and I do kind of like a hand selection for the barrels, actually. So I'll go through all my barrels and pick the very best one, but it's always a different one. I'll have like a runner-up, let's say, but the next time that same runner-up is not the one I'll choose for another instrument. So it really depends on the instrument and not necessarily the player with how the barrel affects the sound.
So what goes into designing a great barrel then? I mean, there's all this talk about like the reverse tapered bore, the different materials. I mean, and why is it that the barrel is always the part that people are sort of chasing down the golden barrel or whatever?
Well, what goes into it? What we did is we kind of started out with, let's say, like a standard buffet barrel in terms of the socket size, because that's what we're hoping to match most of these barrels up with. Of course, they do work on other clarinets, but it's mostly we put them with buffet clarinets. So in terms of socket size, we started at that point. Then we did some experiments with the sockets to see, well, does that make a difference at all? It does make a difference, but I won't get into it too much because it might be kind of proprietary, I'd say. But
yeah, fair enough.
In terms of the bore, we use a reverse taper bore, and we've experimented with the CNC machine. It allows us to experiment around with different tapers and different shapes and all kinds of things like that. So that was just really just a process of trial and error to find the one that we like the best. We ended up with going back to what is kind of the standard for most barrels, and that's just a standard, what's called a 10,000ths reverse taper, which means it's 10,000ths bigger on the top than on the bottom. So we did do a lot of experimentation, but it ended up being that, what everyone else was doing, it seems like that is what played very well for us.
So at the manufacturing level, then, why don't they just come out with barrels that work better for the instruments? It seems odd that this part is always upgraded for people, or is it just an element of personalization like the mouthpiece?
Well, yeah, to get back to your question a few minutes ago that I didn't address, I think the reason people seek out a barrel is because I think it's the easiest thing to swap out. It's also the cheapest. You wouldn't necessarily want to swap out your upper or lower joint, although you could. So those certainly aren't options. But I think besides the mouthpiece, the barrel is the easiest thing to do. And I think once people get a good mouthpiece, they probably, at least in my experience, want to stay with that mouthpiece and try to get the clarinet the best that it can be, and leave the mouthpiece, because the mouthpiece is kind of tailored more to the player than the actual instrument. So at least in my experience, a lot of my customers, they do try out different mouthpieces, but I would say they're much more willing to try out barrels. And there is also a lot more selection in terms of barrels. So there's lots of companies out there that have them, produce them. In terms of bells, that would be, let's say, my next thing that most people would upgrade, and the next thing I'd recommend upgrading. Even those, there aren't too many bell makers out there. There's maybe 3 or 4. And even if you were to go to Buffet and you want to try just some stock bells, that's really not even an option. They match the bells up to the clarinets. That's pretty much how they stay, So what I'm hoping to do, as I prototype these bells more and more, because I think you have one of my bells right now. The one you have is more or less a prototype, and so we're still kind of trying to refine the sound and our process and things like that. But one of these days, let's say, even if it was exactly the same as the stock bell, which it's not going to be, but let's just say it would be really beneficial to have a selection of bells for people to try, because that's just not something that's readily available.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of your products come in this Delrin material, and it's something I'm a little bit unfamiliar with. What's it like to work with compared to wood, and what are the benefits or differences for the customer?
I love working with it. Delrin, for those of you who don't know, is a dense composite material. I don't like to call it a plastic, even though it is, but that denotes kind of a negative stereotype. The Delrin barrels that I produce are professional quality. They're exactly the same in dimension and playability as the wood clarinets, the wood barrels. So I would say, again, going back to what I was telling you about finding the best barrel for your clarinet that matches and harmonizes with it, it's the same thing with wood and Delrin. Now, I would say if I'm trying barrels, I'm personally going to like, just because of the sound in my ear, I like wooden barrels a little bit better for most clarinets. But then there's also clarinets now and then that the Delrin will actually play better. And by better, I mean more resonant, easier to play. The tuning is pretty much the same between the two. And at least with my barrels, what they tend to do is bring everything a little bit closer to being in tune. So if you kind of plotted out the tuning on, let's say, a graph, the stock barrel would be a bit jagged and our barrel would be a little bit smoother, let's just say.
You actually do have that chart on your website. I should maybe share it in the show notes here.
I do.
I've seen it there. Yeah, no, I think you've got a really fantastic selection of products, and I think you're, whether or not people even know it, they're sometimes playing a barrel that has gone through your shop or made its way to the other brands as far as the manufacturer goes. So you're just doing a ton of barrels and products there. Is there anything else you'd like to add to our talk about your products before we move on?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to mention in regards to that, as I said before, we're making barrels for Walter Grabner, but we also make barrels for Clark Phobes. We're looking to work with a few other, let's say, barrel makers as well. But, those two guys really have kind of a big brand, I would say. And so as you said, a lot of the barrels you'll see out there, you may not realize it. We don't put our logo on it. We put their logo on it. But, you know, a lot of the barrels that are produced nowadays are actually produced by us.
That's amazing. Yeah, congratulations on the success with all this.
Thanks.
It's really fantastic. So you've been very generous today with the giveaway on the podcast. There's going to be 2 lucky winners. One is going to be winning a standard wood barrel, length 67, and this would be a perfect pair for someone who plays on a high-pitched mouthpiece, for example, or if you're ever in a condition where it's a little bit warmer, because of course the standard length is 66. I also have a fantastic Delrin barrel in a 66th length. So there's going to be 2 giveaways on this episode. If you want a chance to win those items, just go to www.clarinet.com and enter your email address in the subscription box, and that'll give you a chance to win not only these, but all items mentioned on the podcast. Wes, do you have anything to say to the person who wins these products?
I'm happy that something that I produced could fit on your clarinet and make you sound better. So I hope you like it. Thanks.
That's awesome. Yeah, that must be very rewarding to produce things that are increasing people's playing experience.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I get so much enjoyment when someone comes to the shop and they maybe didn't even realize that some of this stuff existed or that it can make that big of a difference. But it's just it's really cool when someone leaves the shop with a barrel and it's just as simple as putting that thing on that makes them sound a whole lot better.
So where can people find you online? You've got a website, you've got Twitter, do you have Facebook or anything else like that?
I don't have Twitter, although I have a login. I don't use it. We are on Facebook, so we do a lot of, some updates of kind of what we're doing on there. The website is clarinetworks.com. And my email is wes@clarinetworks.com also. So anyone who has any questions whatsoever, I'm always happy to answer any questions. So feel free to contact me if you like.
So I'll go ahead and put all those up in the show notes there. And thanks so much, Wes, for coming on the podcast today. We had just a fantastic conversation, and I know I learned a lot about clarinet repair and how this barrel manufacturer works, and I wish you well with your business.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Clarinet Podcast. If you'd like the chance to win items mentioned on the show, please be sure to head to www.clarinet.com and subscribe with your email address to our mailing list. You'll also receive free content updates, coupons, and more directly to your inbox. If you're enjoying the show, please consider subscribing and leaving a rating and review on iTunes or wherever you happen to listen. If you'd like to support the show directly, you can purchase your new and neat clarinet items at the Clarinet online store at clarinet.com/store. Or you can become a backer on Patreon at clarinet.com/Patreon. That's Patreon. Today's episode was brought to you by our sponsor, D'Addario Woodwinds. Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is refining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with the world's most innovative techniques, so you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit D'Addario.com/woodwinds.